Hello, hello. If I start to sing, you'll all be horrified and then really stop talking. No, I'm just kidding. Give me a mic. Good afternoon. It's fascinating, the 1 o'clock crowd versus the 10 a.m. crowd. I'm seeing a trend here. But thank you for coming on behalf of everyone with Design ADAC and Hearst. I'm Jennifer Levine-Bruno. I'm the Group Publishing Director of Veranda, Elle Decor, and House Beautiful, at least today. There might be something else tomorrow, but let's live for today. And I just want to say I'm going to turn the mic over to Ellen McGauley, who's going to introduce her panelists. Some are here in person, and others are not IRL in real life, but she'll explain that. But I just want to say congratulations to Ellen and to her fearless partner, her editor-in-chief, Steele Marcoux, on the 35th anniversary issue of Veranda magazine, which is the biggest issue in 14 years, since 2008. So it's a real keeper. I want to congratulate David Hamilton, our Vice President of Sales, who's been all over the country making this one happen. And it's definitely, I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank Houghton and Tout for their support and for hosting a reception after this as well, and for being our great partner for this panel. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Jen, for that wonderful introduction. And welcome to everybody. I'm a little bit distracted. I've got this chartreuse thing going on all the way through this. You heard it here first. I was like, oh my God, I love this color. Anyway, welcome everybody. It's so nice to see so many people here. And before we get started, I want to thank ADAC for bringing us all here together. Spring, it's always sort of like the spring meeting of friends, and getting out here and being able to talk to everybody. And like Jen said, IRL means everything. So anyway, thank you so much to Katie and Mackenzie and Cammie and the entire team. We're just so thrilled to be part of this. And I want to thank Houghton and Tout for their sponsorship of this. And I mean, it's just so natural. We were talking about it as we're talking about the power of history in design right now. And like, is there anything more emblematic than Houghton and Tout and the power of history and how it innovates and evolves and becomes something and a story that is being told over decades, over centuries, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. So thank you so much, and we're excited to head to your showroom afterwards. So what we're going to talk about today is, again, the power of history in design. And I've often noted that working at Veranda, it's like a master class in decorative arts and architecture. You know, it's like every story we tell, it's like you got to really dig in, and you're learning something, and you're learning from the best in order to be able to tell the story. Whether it's a story on a new interpretation of chintz or a home in a historic residence in South Georgia, you know, it would be kind of a blank page without the why, without what brought it there. And so, you know, it's kind of like we look at it like, how did it get here, and why is it relevant today, and what does that have to do with, you know, its roots? And so we invite the fabulous, like the raconteur, the storyteller that is great historic design, we invite that onto the page, and to let it tell you the story. And you've heard the adage, as a writer, I love that. You've heard the adage, you want to make someone care, tell them your story. And so that's design, to me, that's design at its most powerful, because it's so much more than aesthetics. It's actually centuries of storytelling that they're coming in and innovating in a way that make them very relevant today. I think at its minimal impact, I think a historic idea or entity is like a focus group. You know, it's whether it could be a building, it can be anything that comes out there and it just says, does it interact with things or does it not, you know? And is it a blip, or are there waves along the centuries to come? And so it's sort of the environment that decides. And what I love about this panel and this topic is that we're going to talk about how we decide things every day. It's not this faceless group that came before, you know, generations before, that's deciding whether something's important. As you get into renovations every day, as you get into your projects, you might see something and you say, you know, to get rid of that aspect of this historic property would be to like cut off its arm, you know? Or this is something that never belonged here in the first place. So actually, we're still the focus group of, what's important and what is actually the raconteurs, the storytellers, for centuries to come. And so I am going to introduce this panel and the best of the best in determining this. So first we're going to start with Ron Woodson and Jaime Rummerfield of Woodson and Rummerfield's House of Design, Los Angeles-based firm. We have so much lovely California at ADAC this year. It's so exciting. I first got to know Ron and Jaime when we did our January-February issue where we named them some of our next legends of design. And what we were recognizing is that they have a very clear point of view, and a lot of that is this very old Hollywood, but very livable, very modern, but there's so much why behind your design, and we were noticing that, but also what they're doing with preservation in California. They were answering a question that Steele and I had. A lot of us, when we think about preservation and the stories in these old houses, a lot of the Southeast, we think of the old architecture of the South or early American architecture of New England, but in the newer landscape of California, that's a very important story. And so they've answered that question, and they're going to answer that for you today. But they've been published in House Beautiful and Veranda, and they were in Met Home's Top 100. And I want to welcome you to the stage today. And you got in a little late last night, so I'm real excited you're here.
Or a little early this morning.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So we didn't pull them out for like a 9 a.m. panel. We're it's civilized. So also reminding us that the pandemic keeps poking its head up. We have Brockschmidt and Coleman who are joining us from New Orleans, and we're so excited that they are here, and they had a little bit of a snafu with COVID, but are, as you can see, well and healthy, and joining us from New Orleans here. So, oh, that's right. By the way, if it looks like I'm staring off into space, I'm supposed to look at the camera back there in order to speak to them. So I'm not just zoning out, and neither are they when they're speaking to them. So I first got to know Courtney and Bill when I was down in New Orleans for a design event, and in their wonderful Shotgun House office on Magazine Street in New Orleans, which is also very emblematic of the power of history and design, and their design shop, Sood, which is sort of a little journey into Sicily, which was, anyway, they're better now, so you can stop in as soon as tomorrow. So anyway, they just couldn't make it here. But they've been published everywhere, from AD to Elle Decor, New York Times to Wall Street Journal, and most recently in Veranda, in our anniversary issue with this. And this was, the text hadn't even come in yet when we started talking about doing this panel with them. And so you could tell that they had used the house to tell that this is, it's over Faulkner House Books, and it's the residence above it. And you'll see some of the pictures appearing on the screens. But that's what we published, and they had basically walked in and saw this residence, and I could tell that they let the house speak to them. And then I read the text, and it's amazing how thoughtful they were with what needed to stay, what, in terms of livable design today, but this very old townhouse in New Orleans that's full of all of that beautiful New Orleans vernacular. So I want to welcome Courtney and Bill, and just thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being here. I also feel like a correspondent on the news where you're like, and then over to them in New Orleans, what's going on on the ground in New Orleans? Welcome. We can hear you, right?
Can you hear us?
Yes. All set. Everyone's so excited to see you.
Great, okay. Well, happy to be here.
Great. Okay, well, let's just dive in. Jaime and Ron, your background growing up in LA was very influential to sort of what you saw as preserving, in terms of preserving historic architecture. Ron, your father was a jazz musician in LA. Talk about the playground that you grew up in terms of the architecture that was around you and what you kind of grew up knowing as sort of the vernacular of LA.
I had a very interesting childhood. As you said, my dad was a jazz musician. He was a bass player, and he played with everybody. He played with all the greats. And one of the biggest clients that he worked for, he was in a trio, and he worked for Doris Duke. and I got to run around her house when he would rehearse. And she got to love me as a kid. And so I got a chance to really see how grand living was really done from a very early age. And I couldn't go back and talk to my other friends about it because they couldn't experience that.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting. I grew up around, I was the baby, so I grew up around a lot of adults, and so I was very mature very early. And so coming from that, I really appreciated grand living and grand lifestyle, and just how, really curated spaces, just how they made a difference. And then coming from Hollywood, it made a huge difference also. Because he also did a lot of studio work, and he was in film, and so I got a chance. He carted me around with him a lot. And I got a chance to sit on sound stages and that kind of thing. So I saw set design, and I absorbed it.
This was your normal growing
Right.
up,
It was my normal.
Which is amazing, you know,
Yeah.
and especially as we think about the vernaculars that we all grew up with, it's just fascinating. And that's part of what drew you together as both natives of LA, and you saw a lot of, you basically were growing up around, the theatrics of Hollywood. Jaime, tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what you grew up as your normal architecture.
Right, my family, it goes back many generations of native Angelenos, and we really take pride in the history of California as well as Hollywood. And growing up as a kid, you would drive down the street and see all these beautiful theaters or very interesting buildings, and not even knowing what they were, but it was just kind of, whether it's Googie architecture, which means theatrical architecture, or a shoe that's a shoe store, but the building's a shoe, like those type of buildings that you would see driving down Sunset Boulevard or Hollywood Boulevard, and you become nostalgic for these things. And slowly over time, you start seeing them disappear, and we're like, wow, this is a tragedy, actually, because that really shapes LA and Hollywood, and these type of things really tell the story of who we are. And Ron and I, being in business 2 decades now, almost 20 years.
But I'm only 26.
It's like prodigy. So we've witnessed so many glorious estates that will go on a job site for a project, and we're looking at this amazing house, and the first thing they'll say, so we're going to tear it down, and we want to build something modern. And we're like, we're talking Gordon Kaufman architecture, Wallace Neff architecture, things that are so glorious.
Yeah.
And they don't build them anymore the way they used to. And so we thought, how do we call the design police? Like, who do you call?
Right.
This cannot happen. Like, do they understand this is not okay? Yeah. And really, we found there is no recourse at all, especially in California. And I commend the cities that have more of a preservation program, because California does not. And so we set out on our own to make a difference and change that. And we started an organization called Save Iconic Architecture, which is kind of our night job. We do interior design by day, and then this crime fighting at night. And so, because the architectural crimes that happen in California are really atrocious. And so, then going on to design school, I started learning about all these buildings, and we have world-class architecture in California, whether it's the case study programs, all the modernist architecture, Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, and just to see that this is something we need to embrace instead of forget. It's really something we've taken on to champion and support. Yeah.
And we've pulled our staff, our design staff, and in fact, one of them is sitting in the front row here. Jennifer was one of our staff members, and when we were doing something with preservation, we've always done something with preservation, and we would pull the staff in and say, well, you got to help us do this and that, and then it became a real problem, because in the last 10 years, we've had this huge proliferation of quote-unquote developers who have come into Los Angeles, and a lot of times it's people from other states that just come in and the dirt is so valuable in Los Angeles that if you don't know the history of the homes, they tear them down because they have no meaning to them. And we finally said somebody's got to do something, and we started SIA from that.
Yeah, and I love that, and I love the crime fighting thing. I love that. We figure out what these uniforms look like.
Right,
They're very
right.
chic.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Super chic, right?
Yes, no doubt.
But, and I think, and this is such an interesting perspective for a lot of us to hear, because again, like over on the East Coast and going over to Bill and Courtney, is that they're designing in an environment that has been well known for its historic architecture. And, before we get into that, Bill, I want to, because it's such an interesting juxtaposition. Bill, if we talk about what your early landscape was, what you were looking around at as a child, and what kind of, your normal was. Talk a little bit about that, because it's a very different landscape from we're going more to early American, aren't we?
Well, when I was a child, we lived in suburban Richmond, and we went on a lot of family trips to Williamsburg and the colonial mansion houses, and we would drive around during Historic Garden Week, looking at private houses and gardens. And so it was always interesting because it was a trip to go visit something, whether it was a museum or something that was open to the public. But then my family moved to Winchester, Virginia, when I was just about to enter high school. And I was not excited about that. It seemed remote and maybe kind of like a place where Hicks lived. And I ended up loving it, and it's in my adopted hometown. It's a town in the Shenandoah Valley, about 20,000 people. And it's remote enough that it's not part of Northern Virginia. And we lived in a kind of normal house. It wasn't a historic house, but I was able to walk to school, walk downtown to shop, and walk to church. There's a beautiful limestone Beaux-Arts library that kind of stood out like an amazing sore thumb. And that's where I learned that historic architecture isn't just about museums and things you go see. It's about a lifestyle, and it really enriched my lifestyle. I became a member of Preservation of Historic Winchester, and that's really where it all kind of, the vibrancy of architecture as part of life came together. And then I went to the University of Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson's academical village was a sublime place to study architecture. And there was even a class, an old man who, Freddie Nichols, and we studied Jefferson's architecture, and we went on a lot of field trips to his houses and really got to see how inventive and creative Jefferson was with the classical language. And eventually I made my way to New York and took an intensive 6-week program for the Institute of Classical Architecture. And that's how Courtney and I actually met. We were both volunteers for the Institute of Classical Architecture. It was a tiny thing back then. But one of the things that we did with our group of friends there, another Virginian, we planned a few trips down to Virginia and spoke with Calder Loth of the Department of Historical Resources in Virginia. And we continued to go into private houses in Virginia. And we all had just a great time seeing this beautiful architecture. And that actually evolved into the travel programs of the Institute of Classical Architecture. So, so that's, I mean, it's been ingrained, but it was also a learning experience.
Yeah. It was something that you pursued after kind of growing up around it, and like, I want to learn more,
Exactly.
Yeah. And by the way, those travel programs at the ICA are pretty amazing. I was lucky enough to kind of tag along on one of them, and just hung on to every word. Courtney, Mississippi. That's where you grew up, right? So tell us a little bit about what was around you. Sorry.
Yes, proud.
Look at
you. So I grew up in a fairly small town called Corinth. It was in the northeast corner, and it is a really pretty little town with an oak-lined main street, beautiful courthouse square with a neoclassical building, pretty thriving downtown. And I think one thing that was really an influence, not just in my little town, but really in all of Mississippi growing up, was living in a restored old house was kind of a prestigious thing. So that was sort of the coolest place to live, would be in an old house. And I was also influenced a lot by my grandmother's sister, who was an early lady decorator in the Mississippi Delta, and she kept us supplied with stacks of magazines and books, and took me on trips to market to Dallas and Atlanta and New York. And I still remember, turning the wings at Count and Tout, and we always went to house museums and historical sites to look at things. And so learning about historical decorative arts from her was a really big influence on my career as well. And then what I just wanted to say also back to Corinth, one thing about that is there were a few buildings in town that had been very carefully preserved with great effort by a couple of citizens. And these buildings, to use your word, were very emblematic of the town. And they're the buildings that people think of when they think about my hometown. And I think the moral of that story is that it's really important to try to make a difference. And the history of preservation is filled with people who are tilting at windmills and were able to save buildings. So I think that's a big theme that we're going to talk about today.
I talked about preservation being kind of a cornerstone and very important to Veranda, and a lot of the things at the very outset when Steele and I first started talking about what the houses that belong in Veranda is that we always look for a sense of place and a sense, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a sense of history as in it's an old house. It's not about era, it's about a sense of belonging and not having it, be sort of an Alice in Wonderland kind of thing, like where is this? And I think when we're replacing a lot of these buildings that without a sense of what was there before or what was emblematic of the town, as you say, Courtney, that's part of what we're going to talk about is that, it's about sense of place. So there's all of these different stories that get cut out, as we're talking about these, maybe where there's not as much protection over these buildings and not as much. And again, some of this is on a small scale, I think, with designers. You are all walking into these renovating projects and your eyes are on them. So there's just so much, like I said, like focus group power there. Like, does this belong or doesn't it, So, and I wanted to focus on I just think that how we've trained our eyes, and I've seen some kids in the audiences, and I was thinking about how Courtney has said that she did all of this kind of going along to some of these trips, and that was very influential. This is the normal we grew up with, and I think it really influences the impact we make going forward. Going back to Save Iconic Architecture, can you tell us a little bit about, I believe there was a job, right, that really kind of instigated it, where you walked in and you were so excited about the job, and then what happened? And that was a catalyst to this.
There are actually two.
Okay.
I'll
Yeah.
let you start with the first one.
We got a call to go out to Bel Air for a client that had just bought a new house, and we were really excited. We're like, oh, okay, to do the interior design and meet with them, and we didn't know anything about the house. And so we pulled up, and we were early, and we stared at the house like, God, this is a classic Bel Air estate. It's kind of an American colonial style. It was pink and a lot of mature landscape, and we thought, this is fabulous. You could imagine some starlet living there over the years. Sure enough, it was Jim Backus's estate, that was Mr. Howell, Mr. Magoo. This was his house, and he had just passed away, basically. His wife sold the house to this family, and we thought, oh, this is going to be great. This house is so fabulous. And they pulled up, and right away we started to realize, oh no, like you could tell they were just not interested in the house at all. They had no interest in keeping it the way it was. They wanted to change it all. And so they said, let's do a tour, and then basically we want to just tear this all down. And we just said, And so Ron and I begrudgingly walked through the house with them, oh gosh,
I think
everything.
That's called trudging.
Yes.
Just slogging through the house.
Yeah.
Well, we literally hadn't gotten past the foyer when they said, well, we just bought it,
but it's too small.
but it's too small, so we're
Then
going
why'd
to
you
tear
buy
it
it?
down.
Yeah, and we both said, you can't do
In
that.
unison, we said, you can't tear
do
this house
that.
down.
You don't want to do that. Basically, And they said, oh, it's too small, we can't live this way. And so we went through, and clearly we didn't take the job, but that was where we looked at each other so hopelessly, like, what can we do? Because this is tragic. Everything about the property was so glorious. And so we called the LA Conservancy, and they said, oh, okay, well, just, basically we're too busy, don't bother us with this. And I kept really haunting them about this property and others, because it was haunting me, really. And they said, why don't you just write a nomination for it? Why don't you just landmark it yourself? You don't have to be the owner. Just write it up so it gets in front of the city. And the way the city of LA is, it's really backwards, is they rely on the community to bring forth these issues. The council members, the city planners, they aren't proactive in, oh, there's that important house, let's protect it. It's more like, if there's a ruckus and a crisis, then we'll take a look at it and fine, we'll landmark it, because our city is not based in culture or the arts. I would say the arts. The city of LA, their priorities are not in the arts or culture or architecture, for that matter. So they rely on the people who are in that field, which is, I guess, nice that they want involvement, but really it's the Wild West still, and there's no preservation programs. So all we're doing is really trying to step forth and give these important places a voice. And it still stands today. We didn't nominate it because we've learned a lot about their criteria for preservation. It has to be a very notable architect. A lot of details where there's a gray area, and there's no tiers. Like other cities have class 1, class 2, other types of tiers. Here it's just 1, and if you don't meet it, too bad. So things need to change.
Yeah.
And but it prompted us, like, wow, this is a real issue that needs to be addressed, and we can make a difference. So let's go for it.
Well, and the other thing is when you go to get a demo permit, the city doesn't know. You're just given a number. So they don't know if the house is a Richard Neutra or if it's a shack on First Street. And so that's a real problem. So as we go forward, we have become more delved into city practices and also city government. And actually the city has asked us to put together a program, and it's like, okay, that's not what we do, but we're opening up to that option, because until there's real change that way, nothing's going to change. There's 2 people in the Office of Historic Resources in Los Angeles, a city the size of Los Angeles, 2 people.
Amazing. Yeah.
We don't even have a city historian.
No.
So
And,
it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
and then the second story, and that was the real catalyst, was we have a client who we've done 4 projects with, great client, and she wanted a double lot to build a compound for her and her family in Beverly Hills. And we had a realtor that we were working with, and she said, well, I'm going to take you to see this house. It's on a double lot. It's on Hillside. But there's this old crappy Neutra on it. And we said, wait. Literally, we said, wait, an old crappy Neutra. And she's driving. We're going uphill, and we see it. And Jaime and I are just like, we're totally checked out at that point with her. And so we get to the house, and we meet the owner, and it's the Chewy estate. And it had never been on the market. The Chewy's had it built with Richard Neutra in 1955, and Mr. Chewy died tragically in a car accident in the 80s. And Mrs. Chewy lived on to 2006. And they had no children, so the house went to a niece of hers and a nephew-in-law. And they just wanted to offload the house, but they were touting the house as a teardown. And so Jaime and I left there, and we started calling everybody that we knew that could come up with $15 million to buy a house. And nobody bit first.
Right.
And it got to a point where we kept going up there, and they actually barred us from the house because we.
Well, I'm like, we have to write the nomination for this, because the Chewy house is one of Richard Neutra's top 10 works.
Top 10.
Julia Schulman has a glorious collection of photos of this house. And to see it in person, because it's never been in the public domain, was really a treasure. And so our historian who writes the nominations, he's like, I need photos of the interior. And I was like, okay, get you up there. And so I said, oh, we have an inspector coming that wanted to do a survey just to see the house, if it's in, what shape it's in. They're like, okay. And so, because we did not want them to know we were going to nominate this.
And then did Ron dress up as an inspector?
See? No, our historian came up until he blew the cover. Like he just was a bad actor completely. Because he kept talking about the site plan and the surveys and the engineering. I'm like, don't talk about that. Like just get your photos and let's go. And because nominations, at least in LA, it's such a foreign concept. Everyone thinks it's a bad thing. When really, in our opinion, if you have a piece of architecture that has provenance, it's so priceless, it's so valuable. This is a piece of art, and it's a one-of-a-kind piece of architecture. And so for us, the value is so great, and it's a part of our history and culture. And so we wrote the nomination for it. It went through fine. But it's just funny, again, this like the crime fighter type, detective work and the forensics. Like it's funny because this is so out of our wheelhouse, but it makes it really interesting. And so, but we did save that house.
We did.
And we did find an owner who bought it that we knew, and they're completely restoring it and doing a nice addition and doing exactly what you would hope would do. But it was all for the effort and just putting the word out. And funny enough, those types of dollars do exist with the right people and the right crowd of people. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities.
Well, and that's a great success story. I didn't realize that you had saved that house. That's a great one. The landscape in New Orleans in terms of protection is pretty different, right, Bill and Courtney? What do you see there in terms of when you're getting projects and what kind of, I don't want to use the regulations, protections are already in place?
Well, we both live in the French Quarter, which is probably one of the most restrictive and protected areas in the world, and not in the world, at least in the country, maybe in the world. Drones that they go around and make sure even the backyards and courtyards, things that you can't see from the street are complying. And it makes it a little difficult for some of the people who live in the quarter because it's a colorful neighborhood. It's not only for architecture aficionados. But it's a good thing. The French Quarter is such a remarkable place in terms of architecture and culture, and it's more a collection of things that make it a whole rather than one or two architectural monuments, because it's evolved culturally in so many different ways after fires and different communities who have come into the French Quarter. It has a Sicilian connection. The first Progresso soups was invented in the French Quarter. So one of the buildings that kind of looks like a antebellum cast iron building was actually a Progresso soup purpose-built factory. But I think there's also the people of New Orleans love their houses, they love their architecture, they love their history. So I don't think there's quite the tear down mentality here.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, New Orleans has one of the oldest preservation movements in the country that really started in the late 1800s when the city council was going to tear down the Cabildo and the Presbytery because they thought that they were dowdy old Spanish buildings, the kind of the crappy Nortras of the day maybe. And a group, including the Louisiana Preservation Foundation, rose up against it and they prevented that from happening. And then in the 60s, the notorious Robert Moses, master planner, was hired to come into New Orleans and improve the arterial traffic. And part of his suggestion was to build an expressway that would be right along the river in the Vieux Carré. And again, coming back to this idea of people really making a difference, these two young lawyers fought it all the way out to the Supreme Court, and they spoiled it. And, I think there are a lot of those inspiring stories. And another thing I think that is so cool about New Orleans architectural history and preservation is dating back to, I think, the 1730s. There's a body of documents called the notarial archives from notary. So it was records of every building purchase and transfer that happened. And part of the reason that was started is when a building was sold, there had to be a notice posted in a public space that this particular property was for sale. And after a while, that became kind of advertising. So the sellers would create these kind of flashy placards for their buildings that included these beautiful watercolor renderings of site plans and facades. And so all of that is still in the collection, for hundreds of years. And it's an amazing resource. And people have copies of these watercolor renderings framed in their houses and things like that.
It really raises the bar for sale, all of those kinds of listings, to have these watercolor renderings. I bet they're very valuable, actually.
So the pressure is not so much demolition probably, but just quality of life. There's so many tourists who come to the French Quarter and come to New Orleans, and it's not tourists only coming for the architecture. There's boozy drinking tours and ghost tours and music tours. And New Orleans is not just the architecture either. It's so many different things. But kind of the big business of tourism and the big business of bars, at least in the French Quarter, there's always this pressure for the few residents of the quarter to a real, live, evolving, thriving neighborhood. Schools and grocery stores and the type of things that keep it evolving and not static and not just a tourist place. And that's probably the biggest pressure.
Well, and broadening out not just from New Orleans, but any project that you do, because you work in so many lovely historic places, and we've talked a bit about your work in New York when we were talking earlier. What kind of homework do you do? How much homework do you do when you go into a project to really figure out, again, like, what's the story that came before, so that can then feed your design?
Well, I think it is very much about the story that came before. And most of our clients really love being part of that story. So they're very interested in doing the research and bringing back parts of buildings that are important to them, that kind of resonate with them. So we do a lot of historical research using historical American Building Survey drawings. We travel, look at period rooms. We also do really nerdy things like go to the historic curtain conference at Winter Tour.
Did you say the historic curtain conference?
Curtain conference. And if you can believe it, there are people who still know how to hand sew swags and chapeaux.
Oh, I love that.
18th century methods. And we actually go to a lot of museums, including Winter Tour and Williamsburg, to look at how furniture was upholstered, how fabrics were printed, how curtains were made with trimming and lining, and how they were installed. And so the history and preservation of decorative arts, and along with architecture, has been something that's been really important to us too.
And the research is not even just for historical houses. Sometimes we'll have a client that has a collection that has nothing to do with the house itself, but we really jump into the collection and see what is so interesting. What interests the client about this collection? How will it affect the new story of the house? Or they may have a passion for a historical style or a new style of furnishings that we don't know that much about, or maybe don't even like, but then we start to get into the details and find it fascinating and kind of jump into that. One of the most interesting recent research projects happened because we were putting we found out there was a foundation missing in a French Quarter house. And so we had to do a little digging, and one of the contractors found a bone that he thought was a human bone.
It turned out to be a pig.
But it ended up getting some archaeologists involved, and there was a student dig, and such interesting things that will now be part of a big display cabinet in the house. They found some pottery, shards of pottery that predate the city of New Orleans. They were Italian 17th century that someone brought in the 18th century. And then they also found a spirit animal that had the remains in undisturbed soil that had been placed under an upturned copper or cast iron pot. So that was also very interesting.
Voodoo research.
Yeah. Well, now, you know, when you're designing, when you're walking into a historic home, a lot of times these have been, there's been renovations before you get there and all of that. Jaime and Ron, you know, you're also designing for modern livability. You know, there's a balance there, right? There's not everything needs to be saved. There might be some things that need to go back. How do you kind of approach that balance when you're starting a new project in historic?
Again, going back to one thing I wanted to go back to when you talked about education and research, that's one of the other things that we do at SIA. We provide education and awareness. And the reason that we do that is to try to enrich the community, specifically in Los Angeles, to learn about the history. And if you know a little bit more, you may not be so apt to.
Yeah, you want to make somebody care?
Exactly.
Tell them their story.
Exactly.
Right.
But we will go through and do extensive research on a property, what it was, if it had been changed at all. There's a property, there's an area called West Adams in Los Angeles. It's one of the oldest areas in Los Angeles. And there's a house now that someone bought, and it's a friend of mine, his cousin bought it. And he called me to ask me about what Jaime and I could do to help them. And he started to tell me what she was thinking about doing to the house. And I was in my car and I was just holding the steering wheel like I was cringing. And I immediately called Jaime, and this particular house was built in 1905. It's a Georgian colonial, and it has had lots of work done over the years, but there's plans to it. So there's ways to take it back, but there's also ways to make it livable for the 21st century.
Yeah.
So we don't live by the adage that it has to be a total time capsule, because that's just not realistic for people. But at the same time, I'm not going to open it up to an open floor plan where it shouldn't be. So there's a lot of research that goes into, and our clients now come to us for that. So we don't really have to convince our clients so much.
It's become part of what differentiates you, I think, is what you had made a point earlier about that, right? Is that it's kind of, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it in an earlier conversation, but I think it kind of streamlines the process, is they know what they're getting with you.
Right.
They do. They know what they're signing up for.
Yeah.
And yes, it's not as convenient maybe to take the time to do the homework or the research or really preserve or rehabilitate something that exists. But I see the open floor plans, which we are all for as well. It really is all about context of the site. And so we're not against a certain look or style. It's more of taking into account the property you're evaluating. And if it's a historic house in LA, to me, that's such a part of the storytelling. And the 1905 colonial that Ron's talking about, it's rare. I mean, it's of such a time when, you know, the architect was John Austin. He did the Shrine Auditorium, the City Hall downtown. Like, we're talking about an epic architect, and these people just have no idea. It's really a tragedy to see something get just not considered at all as far as notable.
Right, that's
And
the
so
distinction, not considered at all.
Yeah.
Because a point that I think Courtney and Bill, you had said, there's a difference between preservationists and designers working in historic design, right? So, you know, when you're going into it, you're actually looking for what needs to be done rather than, you know, this is just this, like, okay, this can be an open floor plan kind of thing, right? There's a difference. It's not like you're advocating for, let's go back to the beginning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we were in architecture school, we learned about this concept robust buildings that lasted for the ages. And it's why we have New York loft apartments and why we have barbecue restaurants and gas stations, because they can be adapted to different uses, and the architecture even amplified in some cases.
And I think you have to evaluate the rarity of the building. Is this an amazing, exemplary, example that should be preserved because it is so rare or does everything so perfectly? Or is it part of a contributing neighborhood, or the sum of the parts together with sympathetic renovations kind of can either enhance it or preserve the style? I think there's a lot of buildings that we love weren't built one time and then stayed the same. Like
Right.
Jefferson had Monticello and then went to France and then tore it all down and built a giant portion on it. Or one of our favorite buildings, Osterley Park, was a Jacobean castle that Robert Adam inserted a neoclassical peristyle, and it's loved for that contradiction. So I think there's a lot about evolution that we like to look at as well. I think the Faulkner House project that's in Veranda, that is a historic building that's in the heart of a historic city. It has literary connotations, but the interior decorating that we preserved is from the 1980s. And, but it's such a part of the story now, and the story of this couple who founded and opened bookstore and then decorated this house, saved the building, and decorated, really created something that the building never was. But now that's part of the story, and that's worth preserving, but not embalming, making it into something that's new for the new owners. And so they love that they're part of a continuing story.
And I loved, what I loved about that too was that you looked at some of the colors that were part of this. You know, it wasn't just about the architecture. It was about a lot of the colors that had become part of the fabric. And so it was really amazing to look at what had remained. I want to leave time for questions, but I do want to say, and I don't think, actually, Courtney and Bill, you might not have heard this because it was just sort of whispered to me right before we started, but you have a very breaking success story, right, with Save Iconic Architecture, correct?
Yes. The Standard Hotel, which is a big celebrity, it was a celebrity hotel for many years, and it had several incarnations over the years. It started out as a motor inn, and then it was a convalescent hospital, and then it turned into a hotel again. Well, it had never been messed with, ever, thank goodness. It was built in '62, and as of last week, we were able to save it. So it's deemed, it got national status. Yeah.
I mean, that was a Woodson and Rummerfield project from the beginning. Like this is a danger, right? And had you all not gotten into this?
Yeah, the Standard closed during the pandemic, and it's known as a titan of the Sunset Strip. And it was just dormant. And we thought, you know what, let's just instead of it being a crisis, let's just proactively nominate it. And we wrote the submission. It was 130 pages of all the defining characteristics of the architecture, what made it so prolific as a piece of LA history, not to mention Andre Balazs and the Standard Hotel, and even being on Sex and the City, or so many different outlets that the Standard Hotel, and this was the first one, even though there's 6 now. And so we wrote the nomination. Sure enough, it went up for sale. I believe that Ian Schrager bought it, which is great news as well, and they had no objection to the nomination, which only, again, enhances its value. And we were with the Preservation Commission on Monday, and it was a unanimous vote to give it a historical designation. So,
what a great story.
Yeah, we're really proud of that, so yeah.
Congratulations.
Yes.
You heard it here first. That's another thing. You heard chartreuse and here and this.
And there was a picture of it in the rotating pictures. There was a picture of it, I believe.
Yes.
Going through. So yeah.
Questions before we head over to Count and Tout. Oh, right over here.
Okay, perfect. Oh, there we go. Thank you for waiting for my microphone. is less of a question and more of a commendation. I come from a long line of preservationists who were formative in the establishment of Winnetou and Williamsburg, down to the local level of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation and the Atlanta History Center. But for the past decade, I lived in Los Angeles and wrote for a lot of publications and got involved with a lot of architects who were working on mid-century restorations. And I actually held a roundtable with Dean Noda and some other architects out there to discuss Cliff May and Ray Coppi, other architects of that ilk. And so I know what you've been up against, and I just want to say thank you and applaud you, because it is a really tough market to get the attention of historic preservation in the Southern California area. So I know what you've done. It's exponentially more than we have to do here.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
We're starting
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah, okay.
Here we go.
So if you live in a historic home, you're working on a historic home, how do you address the architecture when it comes to the interior? Say it's a very specific architectural style. Do you take cues from the architecture, the interior, or you just say they like modern furniture, they live in a colonial, we're going to do it, or does that make sense? Yeah.
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 I think architectural integrity is very important. You have to listen to a space and work with what it's trying to tell you. And so, sure, you travel all over Europe, you'll see a very historic building with beautiful modern interior. And so it can coexist, and it's really developing that visual vocabulary with space. And so I think the worst thing someone can do is eliminate the original character. I think originality is authenticity, and that's so important to space, is being authentic. If you're forcing something or trying to make it something it's not, it won't be successful.
I would also add, too, that there's this really lovely note in the Faulkner house where, there's these lovely, mid-century touches that kind of, give this wonderful, push-pull in there. And so I think that also, Courtney, Bill, would you kind of agree they can all coexist, right?
Yeah, I think if you evaluate, do you want something that synthesizes and seems like it could have been an improvement on the original? Do you want to contrast in a way that also might accentuate the original? I think one thing that's always been a little tricky is the kind of 1970s Secretary of the Interior standards that mandate anything new has to be of our time. And so there's a lot of kind of modernist talk of, well, anything that replicates the past but isn't the past is pastiche. And we just don't feel that's true. We feel like if you're putting in a new doorway that didn't exist and you want to use the same proportions and moldings, that's great, and it looks like a seamless, beautiful addition to the house rather than a sore thumb. Or if you want to have a beautiful modern kitchen, but you have the cornices that keep the fun. Right now we're working on a house that a bedroom is being made into a bathroom. We're trying to incorporate the fireplace, even if it's kind of in a funny location, just to give the history of the house. And the bathtub might be a modern bathtub, but it might sit in front of this beautiful Greek Revival mantle.
But I think also going back to Ellen, what you were saying, and Jaime too, there are times when a piece of modern furniture contrasts so beautifully with the traditional architecture that it makes you see the piece of furniture and it makes you see the architecture more clearly. So there's definitely a way to do that. But it's important to keep the fabric of the house intact so that it looks like a seamless setting, that you're respecting the setting, and it just feels more comfortable to us. Would be how we would approach a project like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think we're good. Before we close this, I do want to just say thank you so much, Courtney and Bill. I'm so sorry you're not here, but we're so glad that you're better and that you were able to join us. So thanks for making that work. We had both snafus. We had the late arrivals of 1 a.m. and we had those that were joining us remote, but we made it. We did it. And thank you so much to ADAC because you brought Courtney and Bill to us. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I am also very pleased that everybody made it here, whether it was virtually or in person, no matter the time. So thank you all so much. I want to continue this conversation. We're going to go to Cowton and Tout, and that's Suite 225 on the second floor. So join us there. And then I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been here with us for Design ADAC this week. We do have one last presentation at 3 o'clock, but in case I'm not on stage, I just want to say a big thank you. Thank you to Veranda, who's always been an awesome co-sponsor of this event every single year. It feels great to be back. The energy has been wonderful this week. So thank you and enjoy both the reception and the last presentation today.
Thank you.